So the 5 most important ideas of painting are the painting fundamentals. So in this video, I'm going to use this painting of a beer that I did as an example to go through each one of the fundamentals and show you exactly what I'm talking about. I'm also going to critique a student of mine's painting of this beer and show where they can get better at these fundamentals. These are composition, drawing, value, color, and edges. I know in my experience that every single problem I have, I can trace back to one of these 5 fundamentals. So if you think that you have some special, unique, specific problem, you don't. You just need to practice these 5 things. All right, let's start at the beginning with composition. Now you may think, oh, like what kind of composition is there here, Chris? It's just a beer on a table. Well, it didn't just start as a beer on a table. I actually tried to put the bottle on the table as well. And I just couldn't find a good way to arrange it. I just felt like the glass and the bottle were too similar in size and shape. A helpful tip with composition is try to have variety in shapes. You don't want your shapes to be the same size. So I just took out that bottle and left just the glass. Now I also chose to bring the background down as far as I could so that there's just a little bit of the table and a lot more of the background. If I had angled it so you could see more of the table behind it, which you kind of could in the photo, and made it so the frame was kind of cut in half, it wouldn't be as interesting. All right, now let's move on to drawing. Now I did this for a tutorial. In order to make it easier for students to follow along with the drawing, I did a very simple grid. I just put a line going down the center vertically and horizontally and use that to sketch things in using thin paint. And when I draw, I like to use that grid and the edges of the canvas to find certain points. Like I'll find a start point and an end point, and then I connect those points with the drawing. Now you also notice that I did not draw in the handle because I knew that that was all going to be black, and it's much easier just to paint it all black with the background and come back over it with the small little glare shapes that make up the handle. All right, now let's move on to values. Values are so important. Some might say even more important than color. Now, if you don't know, value is how light or dark a color is. And when painting, I always suggest trying to get in a value that you know is easy for you to get. And for this, it was very easy to get the value of the background because it was pretty much just black. Nothing's gonna be darker than that, so at least I have one end of the value scale, and I can use that to compare other values that I put in. All right, let's take a look at this reference photo here. Pop it into black and white. Now I got my background value right there, and you can see how subtle certain shifts in value are. Like even right here in the beer, it gets very close. It's still very, very dark. Even from the background to the ground, it's still very close. This ground in particular, it's really interesting because it has to be lighter than this background, but it has to be darker than the foam. So I'm going to show you that this is pure white right here. And even with this white foam, it is not even close to pure white. And value is how you're going to create form. And you can see here that it's darker here and actually almost just completely blends in certain areas to the background, but it's dark and then it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And this is the lightest area, then it starts getting dark again. And that's what creates this cylinder-like form at the top of the glass. Same at the top here, you see it's a little bit darker right there, and then it gets lighter as it comes over the edge here, which gives the form to all that foam. So as I'm painting the foam at the top of the glass, I am paying very close attention to the value and where it gets lighter and where it gets darker. And I'm comparing those values to my background value, which I know is the darkest value. And sometimes I have to go back and adjust. I'm like, oh, I need to make that darker. I need to make this lighter. But getting those values correct is how we're gonna get the right form on everything. Same thing with the foam at the bottom of the glass. I'm not just gonna paint that one solid color. I'm going to think about the form of that foam. Even with this, I wanna think about the form of it. It's, if I was to draw grid lines on it, or not grid lines, but just kind of show you the flow, or the form, it'd be kind of something like that, it goes and it comes over. All right, now let's take a look at a student's painting. And let's take a look at the values. Now the values aren't too bad, but there are certain areas I feel like they could have pushed a little darker, mainly over here on the side. I feel like they could have pushed that a little bit darker, which would have added more form to the top part of this glass. So when they did get to this lighter area, it popped a little more. I think the ground could have been a little darker, which would have made the foam a little lighter, which would have caused them to not have to go so bright with this foam, which like at the bottom here, I feel like it's lacking form. Definitely could have used some darker values on the edge here. Also think they went too light on the foam right here. You can see how dark I kept mine right there, and keeping it dark right there makes it so the places where you do make it lighter has that much more of an impact. Same thing with reflections. Like I have this very bright reflection right down here. It's probably the only section that's actually pure white. And it's very strong and bold, but when they did it here, since everything else was pretty bright, it didn't hold that same punch. I also feel like certain areas, they lost their darkest darks, which would have helped make the lighter values that much lighter. All right, now let's talk about color. Mainly, I want to talk about color relationships in terms of saturated color and desaturated color. Now in my painting here, certain areas like this orange down here or this yellow, it pops because it's surrounded by the appropriate unsaturated colors. You know, if you look at things like this foam, it's a pretty grayed down, desaturated purple. Even in the light, it's pretty grayed down. You know, even in the beer, these browns are pretty desaturated. Where in the students, I feel like they didn't have the appropriate saturated to unsaturated color relationships. You know, if I take my kind of reddish brown down here, make a spot, compared to theirs down here, you can see how much more vibrant mine is. I actually think they had it kind of flipped a little bit because up here is pretty saturated when that's really an area that should have been knocked back a little bit. I feel like they weren't looking for the saturated colors much because they didn't even get in like the yellow that's down there. But now if you do struggle with color mixing, I'm not gonna go over color mixing in this video because I offer the color mixing lesson from my Foundations of Oil Painting course for free. If you wanna check that out, there'll be a link to it in the description of this video. And lastly, let's talk about edges. Edges are really important in this painting, especially with this foam. You can see how I let the edge of this foam in a lot of areas blend in to the beer. You know, as you can see it right there, there's not like a harsh, crisp edge. That's because the foam thins out on the edges here. It's thickest in the middle, which creates, you know, this kind of cylinder-like form. And edges a lot of times is how you're going to communicate material or whatever the substance is that you're painting. Like again, here on this edge, you see I softened this edge here because it's this foam. You can see right here, the foam just gets blended right into the color of the glass. I also lose edges. You can see that I lose the edge between the beer and the background. Also lose it right there too. Looking at the students, I just feel like they have way too many hard, crisp edges on the foam right here. It's just not really reading as foam. And I feel like they were afraid to lose edges of the beer. Like they felt like they had to define where the edge of the glass is. I feel like they could have a softer edge here just by getting the value of the foam closer to the value of the background. You see here, like I get it pretty dark, so it just kind of fades into the dark there. Now, the way that I get these soft edges is by working wet into wet paint. A lot of beginners are afraid of working wet into wet paint. They're so used to watercolors and acrylics, and they want the paint to dry as fast as they can. But a lot of times you can use that to your advantage. And a lot of times at the beginning of putting something down, I'm letting different colors blend into each other. Because I know as I paint, I can define edges more where I want to. I made a whole video on edges and working wet into wet paint. If you want to check it out, I'll put a link to it above right now. So those are the fundamentals: composition, drawing, value, color, and edges. If you want to check out the full tutorial of painting this beer, it is on my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. And if you want to see what I'm painting on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. I'm Chris Fornatero, here telling you to go get painting.